9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Greetings, my fellow Frame Lower Sovereign Thinkers. Thank you for tuning to LL3 Podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful realms of planet Earth. Today's date is Friday, December 26th, 2025. It is episode 1925. The real story behind the Russia-Ukraine war and what happens next. Before I proceed, you can follow me on multiple social media sites and podcast channels. Just type in Looky Luck number 3, Looky Luck Roman number 3, 3 eyes, or Looky Luck Roman number 3 podcast. In addition, if you have any questions, comments, recommendations, all that good stuff, whatever you do, please use decorum. Hit me via email to ll3.podcast at proton.me. If you're going to donate, go to paypal.me or cash out at /Looky Luck number 3. Well, hopefully the folks around the world had a great Christmas, regardless of what your faith is. If you're offended, no Lenny Bruce for you. Deal with it. Oh man. So I just mellowed out a little bit. Had some fun, just chilled, mingled with people. And shared a video by a group called Sabaton on the Christmas Truce, history version of it. They did a nice job. I remember the last episode I talked about Paul McCartney's The Pipes of Peace, based on that event too, and it was nicely done for Sabaton did. And I've seen them a few times. They're very good what they do. Appreciate what they state. But for the fans, if you're in the United States, we have a custom of tipping the bartenders and waitresses, so we don't care how to do it other places. So learn from it and better yourselves. Like, I'm not going to tell everyone what to do when I'm in another foreign land, right? It's called respect the jurisdiction. So that's one thing I got to say about it. Well, I'm going to be actually doing one pretty short one here. This just came from internationalman.com. The real story behind the Russia-Ukraine war and what happens next came out today. And as it reads, by David Stockman, who wrote this. And it says here, notwithstanding the historic fluidity of borders, there is no case whatsoever that Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was unprovoked and unrelated to NATO's own transparent provocations in the region. The details are arrayed below, but the larger issue needs to be addressed first. Namely, is there any reason to believe that Russia is an expansionist power looking to gobble up neighbors which are not integral parts of its own historic evolution, as is the case with Ukraine? After all, if despite Rubio's treachery, President Trump does manage to strike a Ukraine peace and partition deal with Putin, you can be sure that the neocons will come charging in with a false Munich appeasement analogy. Exactly. We want war, but we want to get involved. We're neocons, yeah. We're cowards, but with big mouths. The answer, however, is a resounding no. Our firm rebuke of the hoary Munich analogy, as it has been falsely applied to Putin, is based on what might be called the double-digit rule. To wit, the true expansionary hegemons of modern history have spent huge parts of their GDP on defense because that's what it takes to support the military infrastructure logistics required for invasion and occupation of foreign lands. For instance, here are the figures for military spending by Nazi Germany from 1935 to 1944 expressed as a percent of GDP. This is what an aggressive hegemon looks like in the ramp up to war. German military spending had already reached 23% of GDP even before its invasion of Poland in September of 1939, and its subsequent commencement of actual military campaigns of invasion and occupation. Not surprisingly, the same kind of claim on resources occurred when the United States took it upon itself to counter the aggression of Germany and Japan on a global basis. By 1944, defense spending was equal to 40% of America's GDP and would have totaled more than $2 trillion per year in present-day dollars of purchasing power. Here's what it says here. As spending as a percent of GDP in Nazi Germany. 1935, 8%. 1936, 13%, 1937, 13%, 1938, 17%, 1939, 23%, 1940, 38%, 1941, 47%, 1942, 55%, 1943, 61%, 1944, 75%. By contrast, during the final year before Washington NATO triggered the Ukraine proxy war in February 2022, the Russian military budget was $65 billion, which amounts to just 3.5% of its GDP. Moreover, the prior year showed no buildup of the kind that has always accompanied historic aggressors. For the period 1992 to 2022, for instance, average military spending by Russia was 3.8% of GDP, with a minimum of 2.7% in 1998 and a maximum of 5.4% in 2016. Needless to say, you don't invade the Baltics or Poland, to say nothing of Germany, France, and the Benelux, and across the English Channel on 3.5% of GDP, not even remotely. Since full-scale war broke out in 2022, Russian military spending has increased significantly to 6% of the GDP, but all of that is being consumed by the demolition derby in Ukraine, barely 100 miles from its own border. That is, even at 6% of GDP, Russia has not yet been able to subdue its own historic borderlands. So if Russia self-evidently does not have the economic and military capacity to conquer its non-Ukrainian neighbors in its own region, let alone Europe proper, what is the war really about? In short, it is rooted in territorial disputes and civil strife in lands which have been vassals or integral parts of Greater Russia for several centuries, as indicated. Ukraine actually means borderlands in the Russian language, connoting stateless areas that were first assembled into a coherent polity by Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev by force of arms after 1920. In fact, prior to the communist takeover of Russia, no country that even faintly resembled today's Ukrainian borders had ever existed. So what NATO's proxy war actually amounts to is an insensible attempt to enforce the dead hand of the Soviet Presidium, as we amplify below. For avoidance of doubt, here are sequential maps that tell the story and which make mincemeat of the Washington NATO sanctity of borders malarkey. First of these is a 220-year-old map from 1800, where the yellow areas depicts the approximate territory of the 5 regions: Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, plus Crimea. This would be allowed to go their own way, including back to Mother Russia, if the key ingredients of the Donald's 28-point peace plan can be resurrected. As it has happened, these regions have voted overwhelmingly during referendums in 2023 and 2014, respectively, to separate from Ukraine in favor of affiliation with Russia. Collectively, the 5 regions were historically known as the aforementioned Novorossiya, or New Russia, has been acquired by Russian rulers. And forgive if I mispronounce these names, forgive me, including Catherine the Great between 1734 and 1791. The red markings within the yellow areas of the map designate the year of Russian acquisition. Self-evidently, therefore, the Russian Empire had gradually gained control over the vast area of the north of the Black Sea before the end of the 18th century. To that end, it had signed peace treaties with Cossack Hermanati, 1734, and with the Ottoman Empire as a conclusion of the Russo-Turkish wars of that era. Pursuant to this expansion drive, which included massive Russian investment and in migration of large Russian populations to the region, Russia established the Novorossisk Governorate in 1764. The latter was originally named by the Empress Catherine, but she decreed that it should be called New Russia instead. There's a map on that so you can see it for yourselves. And I will share that on my footnotes. Completing the assemblage of New Russia, Catherine forcibly liquidated its aforementioned century-long Cossack ally as a Zaporozhian Syk, present-day Zaporizhia, in 1775 and annexed its territory to Novorossiya, thus eliminating the independent rule of the Ukrainian Cossacks. Later, in 1783, she required Crimea from the Turks, which also added to Novorossiya, as shown in yellow area on the map above. During this formative period, the famous shadow ruler under Catherine, Prince Grigory Potemkin, directed the sweeping settlement of Russification of these lands. Effectively, Catherine had granted him the power as an absolute ruler over the area from 1774 onward. The spirit and importance of New Russia at this time is aptly captured by the historian Willard Sunderland. The old steppe was Asian and stateless. The current one was state-determined and claimed for European Russian civilization. The world of comparison was now even more obvious, that of the Western empires. Consequently, it was all more the clear that the Russian Empire merited its own New Russia to get along with everyone else's New Spain, New France, and New England. The adoption of the name of New Russia was, in fact, the most powerful statement imaginable of Russia's national coming of age. In fact, the passage of time solidified the borders of Novorossiya even more completely. 1 century later, the light yellow area of the 1897 map below gave an unmistakable message, to wit, in the late Russian Empire, there is no doubt as to the paternity of the lands adjacent to the Azov Sea and the Black Sea. They were now part of the 125-years old New Russia. Where's Waldo, Ukraine, on this map? After the Russian Revolution, of course, the pieces and parts in this region of the old Tsarist Empire were bundled up into a convenient administrative entity by the new red rulers of Moscow, who christened it the Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic. And like a matter, they created a similar administrative entities of Belarusia, Georgia, Moldavia, Turkmenistan, etc., ultimately confecting 15 such false republics. During the course of this communist state building, here is how and when these brutal tyrants attach each piece of today's Ukrainian map to the territories acquired or seized by the Russian Tsars over 1654 to 1917. That's the yellow area. The old Novorossiya of the Donbass and Black Sea Rim was added to the Ukraine SSR by Lenin in 1922. It's fun because I thought the USSR stood for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it's interesting there. So we'll just keep on going here. The Western territory around Lviv, that known to be as Little Poland and Galicia, were captured by Stalin in 1939, and thereafter, when he and Hitler carved up Poland, upon the death of the bloody Stalin in 1954, Khrushchev made a deal with his Presidium allies to transfer Crimea to the Russian SSR, to the Ukrainian SSR, in return for their support in the battle for succession. Not secession, but succession. All right. In a word, Ukraine is a bastard spawn of communist blood and iron. Yet during the last decade, the Washington and NATO war hawks have spent upwards of $300 billion to ensure that the handiwork of autocratic czars and commissars remain intact into the 21st century and presumably beyond. It is ironic, therefore, that the historically illiterate Donald Trump has a good sense to dispense with one of the stupidest crusades that the war party of the Potomac has yet concocted. So doing, he would enable the failed network of the communist tyrants be made right with history, an outcome that can now happen, and only if Donald gets the Rubio digression back on track. It gives you a little map right here of the modern born in communist blood and iron. Let's go. It's good to look. That's the name of it right here. There's a map for that. So yeah, modern Ukraine born in communist blood and iron. Of course, had the above mentioned 20th century communist trio been noble benefactors of mankind, perhaps their subsequent map-making handiwork and reassignment of Novorossiya and to Ukraine might have been justified. Under this banging counterfactual, they would have presumably combined peoples like of ethnic, linguistic, religious, and political cultural history into a cohesive natural polity and state. This is a nation with perpetuating, defending, and perhaps even dying for. Alice, the reason that Trump is right to attempt to end this bloody catastrophe via partition is that the very opposite was true. From 1922 to 1991, modern Ukraine was held together by the monopoly on violence of its brutally totalitarian rulers. And that becomes more evident when the Kremlin temporarily lost control of Ukraine during the military battles of World War II. During that especially bloody interlude, the communist administrative entity called Ukraine came apart at the seams. That is, local Ukrainian nationalists joined Hitler's Wehrmacht in its depredations against Jews, Poles, Roma, and Russians when it first swept through the country from the west on its way to Stalingrad. Okay, my dog is chewing on something. And then, in turn, the Russian populations from the Donbas and South campaign with the Red Army during its vengeance wrecking return from the east after winning the bloody 1943 Battle of Stalingrad that turned the course of World War II. Not surprisingly, therefore, virtually from the minute it came out from under the communist yoke, when the Soviet Union was swept into the dustbin of history in 1991, Ukraine has been engulfed in political and actual civil war. The elections which did occur were essentially 50-50 at the national level, but reflected dueling 80-20 vote breakouts within the regions. That is, that the Ukrainian nationalist candidates tended to get votes margins of 80% plus in the west central area, while Russian sympathizing candidates got similar polarities in the mainly Russian-speaking east and south. This pattern transpired because of the Iron Hand totalitarian rule ended in 1991, the deep and historical rooted conflict between Ukrainian nationalism, language, and politics of central and western regions of the country and the Russian language and historical, religious, and political affinities of the Donbass and South came rushing to the surface. Accordingly, so-called democracy barely survived these contests until February 2014, when one of Washington's color revolutions finally succeeded. That is to say, the Washington fomented and financed nationalist-led coup d'etat ended the fragile post-communist equilibrium. That is true the meaning of the maiden coup. It ended the tenuous cohesion that kept the artificial state of Ukraine intact for barely 2 decades after the Soviet demise. So save for Washington's destructive intervention, a partition of a communist confected state that had never been built to last would have materialized all on its own, perhaps, like in Czechoslovakia, and likely sooner than later. At the end of the day, therefore, the necessary impending partition of the rogue state of Ukraine is not a case of all legitimate sovereign borders being violated, nor does it involve an assault on the hypocritical notion of a rule-based international order that has not actually ever existed and which instead has been a cover for Washington's global hegemony all along. Yeah, I tell people this. I could attest to one area. What's his name? Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a chief national security advisor under the Carter administration, wrote a good book. And I'm mumbling here. Sorry about that. I'm stuttered here. Sorry. Wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard. He talked about Ukraine, part of the American hegemony. And that would be considered the pivot of conquering Ukraine, politically speaking. So I'll just let you guys check that book out, Grand Chessboard. So by Zbigniew Brzezinski. All right, let's go here. But the lessons are nonetheless profound. History accumulates and eventually leads to destructive but wholly unnecessary outcomes. This is the case today with the utterly foolish action of Washington during the 1990s and the 2000s to bring former Warsaw Pact nations and even breakaway Soviet republics into a NATO alliance whose mission was over and done in 1991. It should have been dismantled then and there. When the old Soviet monster with its 50,000 tanks and 7,000 nuclear warheads disappeared into the dustbin of history, there was no longer a threat to the east. There was no front line to defend. At that point, Washington could have led the world to disarmament and to a revival of the lasting peace that had disappeared in the guns of August in 1914. But now the NATO Section 5 mutual defense commitment to these 31 nations is equivalent to a stupid charity that nearly bankrupt federal government cannot afford in any case. There's absolutely nothing in it for the enhancement of America's homeland security and huge incentives for the politicians of these nations to caterwaul against Russia rather than seek peaceful accommodation. So here it is, the historic moment before us. The Donald now needs old tell Rubio in no uncertain terms to take a hike, then return to the essence of the 28-point plan and agree with Putin to a partition of Ukraine, which I agree. If Rubio don't like it, he can quit and bring his mirror and look himself when he's walking out the door. I called him a glamour boy when I first met him. So seen one of his campaign speeches when he ran for Senate in Broward County. It was like evangelistic. They had signs ready to go. So it was typical political comedy, you can say, right? Theater 101. But I'll continue on here. So doing, he will not only utter the stupidity of NATO's proxy war on Russia, but in the process accomplish something more literally epic proportions, namely the defenestration of the neocons, official Washington, NATO, the rule-based international order, and all the other globalist humbug that has saddled America with $1.5 trillion per year warfare state and global empire that cannot afford and doesn't need. There is note, if the history laid out makes anything clear, it is the real danger to America rarely comes from distant, shifting borders, but from the misguided ambitions of those who gamble with our future in the name of global leadership. As Washington sleepwalks deeper into conflicts that had nothing to do with genuine U.S. security, the stakes for ordinary Americans grow higher by the day. That's why now is the moment to get informed, not after the next crisis erupts. Well, I have to agree with him on that. Because the truth of the matter is, my friends, we don't need nation building, intervening, and anything like that. Commerce to all, alliance with none. That's what Jefferson stated in his inaugural address. And George Washington talked about it in his farewell of 1796. And what's going on in that area has been unusual. Not say unusual, but chaotic, amok. Been like that for a very long time. And I'm not lovey-dovey with Putin or what's that guy, Zelensky. But one thing about him, they try to prop him up. He like Zelensky, like he's some Lord and Savior, a great hero. He's nothing more than a dweeb, a mama's boy, a bend over Bob to the one world order, in my humble viewpoint. People get offended by that, but deal with it. Now, I do recall when he tried to be derisive in the White House, making some alleged threats, and people tried to defend him on that. How pathetic are you? I got my source from C-SPAN, unfiltered. I don't need all the Beakerzoids from no matter what Paranon telling me it's the whole story. So you got plenty of information to go to, folks. Stop being unidimensional. The beautiful people in Ukraine have been detrimented for a great period of time. This war, this conflict has to end. If Zelensky was smart, he will give in or feel the wrath of the Mussolini or Ceausescu effect by the Ukrainian people. I'm not saying it's a threat, but could be a prediction. It's his move. Step down. You're contaminating space. And the folks out there that still want to go to war, behind your keyboards, you go on the front line and see how tough you are. People in Russia don't like it either. They love their neighbors too. That's my intake on this. And that will be it. I thank everyone for listening, but feel free to download the show and share throughout your social media networks. If you have any questions, comments, recommendations, all that good stuff, whatever you do, please use Decorum. Hit me via email to ll3.podcast@proton.me if you're doing it, going to PayPal me or cash.app/lookyourluck3. Once again, thank you for your time. Plus, always remember that the maniac resistance is healthy for the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading the love. And may your guardian spirits be with you.